So welcome to Professor Miriam Cohen, and thank you for being here with us.
Okay, hi, so I'm pleased to be part of the We Rise month-long celebration of women in Poughkeepsie, so thanks for having me. Vassar's commemoration of the 19th Amendment includes a digital exhibition from our library archives, and I wrote an accompanying essay, which tells the story of Vassar's contribution to women's suffrage and sets it in the larger historical context. And the essay covers more than I can talk about here. So what I want to do is take a moment to invite everyone to visit the library's wonderful digital exhibition and the longer essay. And you can find a link to that on the Vassar Library homepage at the bottom under announcements. There's a link for that. So today I'm going to focus on Vassar's suffrage and the connections between the campus, the local community, and beyond. The history of Vassar and suffrage highlights the moment when the campus was forced to abandon the notion that they could keep the college isolated from the events that were happening in the larger community. So that's a piece of this story. And it's also a story that shows how Vassar students, faculty, and alums in participating in suffrage and other social movements both pushed against the prejudices of their day, but also did not, especially when it came to the issue of race, leaving to later generations important work in the fight. So during the first decade or so after the college's founding in 1865, women's suffrage was barely an issue on campus. But things began bubbling at Vassar by the end of the 1880s when a new group of inspirational faculty members arrived. Lucy Maynard Salmon of the History Department, Laura Wiley of English, Herbert Mills in Economics, all supported women's suffrage along with other social initiatives of the day. So can we have the first couple slides, Paul? Okay, so yes, good. And the next slide. Okay, so there's Lucy Maynard Salmon, picture of historian, founder of the History Department. And then the next slide, these all come from the library's exhibition, Laura Wiley of the English Department. Like many of teachers in the early 20th century, they believed that the best educational opportunities for students came when they could make connections between what they were learning on the college campus and the social ferment in the world outside the ivory tower. However, at the time, Vassar's president, James Monroe Taylor, deeply opposed these efforts to incorporate social activism into the life of the campus. Educational opportunities for women, even careers, that was one thing, but involvement in politics was something else again. Chafing against the restrictions, which included a ban on suffrage activities, Salmon, Wiley, both took up residence in the city of Poughkeepsie in the early 1900s. And there they maintained active political lives, participating in a variety of social justice causes, including women's suffrage within the local community and beyond. In 1909, Salmon helped Wiley form the Equal Suffrage League in Poughkeepsie, with Wiley serving as its president. Salmon and Wiley came to Vassar just as the national women's suffrage movement was emerging from a period of deep division. In 1890, the rival factions of the movement united as the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which I'm going to refer to as NAWSA. The women's suffrage movement was growing stronger in the 1880s, thanks partly to the powerful Women's Christian Temperance Union, which under the leadership of Frances Willard threw its support behind winning women access to the polls. In the 1890s, as part of an upsurge in women's social reform, the voting rights movement became even more powerful. Across the country at the time, networks of women mobilized on behalf of many reforms, including women's political rights. Working class women organized in the labor movement. Middle class and wealthy women, often members of women's clubs, tackled issues such as the growing poor neighborhoods across cities and social problems facing immigrants. Excluded by the white women's clubs, hundreds of African American women's clubs focused on family welfare among Black Americans who were dealing with poverty and racism. Black and white women pushed suffrage because they believed it was their democratic right and because they believed that providing women with political power was critical to accomplishing other social goals. At Vassar, by the early 1900s, President Taylor could no longer insulate the campus from the political ferment of the era. Vassar student associations like the College Settlement Association, founded in 1890 to support social settlement houses, the Consumers League, founded in 1900 to campaign against sweated factory labor, the Christian Association, which had been around since 1865, all expressed, according to one historian, social consciousness, reform goals, and service ideals through their work on campus and off. So Vassar's interest in social reform came before its embrace of suffrage, but nevertheless, around 1900, a few students took interest in the issue. Crystal Eastman, class in 1903, would later make her mark as an ardent feminist and avowed socialist and peace activist. So if we have the next slide, Paul, thanks. There's Crystal Eastman. She studied with Salmon and took many courses on economics and the labor question taught by Herbert Mills. By the time she graduated, she already had a reputation on campus as a suffragist. Eastman succeeded her very close friend Lucy Burns, class of '02, as president of Vassar Civitas, an organization that focused on social and intellectual, quote, study of present-day subjects. Burns would later co-found the National Women's Party, working tirelessly to push for the federal amendment granting women's suffrage. Next slide. There's Lucy Burns. As the suffrage movement grew, President Taylor found it more difficult to keep it off campus. Students began debating the pros and cons of the issue. Suffrage was still controversial, not only in the country at large, but at Vassar. Some students opposed suffrage because they believed that women's focus should remain with the private sphere of home and family, leaving the public sphere to men. Others thought women could play very important roles in the civic arena, but not by directly entering politics. And others rejected the whole principle and simply disapproved of suffragists' tactics altogether. In 1909, the student newspaper, the Miscellany, began running editorials advocating for suffrage. Faculty and students were becoming increasingly disturbed by Taylor's ban on suffrage events on campus. Many were furious in 1908 when Taylor refused to allow the renowned social reformer Jane Addams to give a lecture about suffrage on the campus, though other Seven Sisters schools had permitted her to speak. Among those unhappy with Taylor's stance regarding suffrage was Inez Milholland, who was a junior in 1908. She was well known on campus for her talents in theater, her athleticism, and her political activism. Having spent her previous summer break in England with the militant suffragist Sylvia Pankhurst, Milholland decided to confront Vassar's president. Next slide. There's Inez Milholland. That spring, a New York organization, the Equality League of Self-Supporting Women, led by Vassar alum and suffragist Harriet Stanton Blatch, daughter of the famous Elizabeth Cady Stanton, had organized a trolley campaign to promote suffrage throughout New York State. Next slide. And there's Harriet Stanton Blatch. Blatch had formed the organization the year before as the partnership between working class and prosperous women to press for the vote. Milholland invited her to campaign at Vassar as part of this trolley car campaign just before graduation. When Taylor refused to allow the meeting on campus, Milholland led some 40 students to the cemetery just across the campus for an open air gathering. And many of you I know are familiar with that cemetery. It is just across the road from the campus, but it is not Vassar property. Vassar's Suffrage in the Cemetery meeting, widely covered in the New York press, embodies the connection between various social movements that were galvanizing the Vassar students. Blatch herself spoke, as did the noted feminist and socialist Charlotte Perkins Gilman. But according to Blatch's biographer, the star of this protest was labor organizer and immigrant Rose Schneiderman. Just 2 years later, she would play a prominent role in organizing women garment workers in the famous uprising of the 20,000 shirtwaist strikers. And during that New York strike, students and recent Vassar graduates, including Milholland, walked the picket line, and they raised money to support the strikers, and the campus paper reported on the event. Taylor did not change his stance in 1908, but the continuing confrontation between Taylor and faculty and students over this question of keeping political and social issues of the day off campus would lead to his resignation in 1913, and a new era of campus engagement emerged. Vassar's new president, Henry Noble Mccracken, inaugurated in 1915, contributed to the changing campus culture. He was an outspoken proponent of suffrage and a leader in the Men's League for woman suffrage. Importantly, Mccracken embraced this educational ethos of the progressive faculty at the college. He very much believed that students' education should be informed by interests and the concerns of the society in which they were living at the time, local, national, and international concerns. In her short life after her graduation, she died at age 30, Milholland would continue her activism. She fought for suffrage, trade unionism, socialism, and political rights for African Americans. But if we look a bit further at Milholland's career, we can see that when it came to the issue of Black rights, the vision of a truly inclusive democracy was limited. So to illustrate, I turn to the famous 1913 Suffrage Parade, which took place in Washington, D.C. the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. By then, a group of militant suffragists led by Alice Paul, along with Vassar's Lucy Burns and Crystal Eastman, were exerting new influence in Nassau. The suffrage movement at the time was proceeding on two tracks because of our American federalist system, which leaves to states the right to enact their own laws with respect to much of our civic life, and that includes most of our policies regarding our elections, as well we know. So, one way for women to gain the right to vote was to win it state by state, and that had been going on for decades. But by 1913, only 9 states had granted women the vote, and those are mostly states out west with few inhabitants eligible to vote anyway. The other way to obtain suffrage would be through a federal amendment, and that's what we're commemorating this year. That would prohibit any state from discriminating on the basis of sex when it came to voting. In theory, Nassau was pushing both the state-by-state campaigns and for the federal amendment. But in fact, they were more concerned in those days with the state campaigns. Frustrated by the painfully slow pace of the state-by-state strategy, Paul and Burns began pushing Nassau towards a more focused campaign on behalf of a federal amendment. The two activists, under the auspices of Nassau, organized the first national suffrage parade in Washington to focus on the federal campaign. The event was nothing short of spectacular. Just behind the Grand Marshal, the close associate of Burns and Paul, Inez Milholland Boissevain, rode a white horse. By 1913, Milholland, who had already led 2 New York City suffrage parades, had become a media sensation. Next slide. So here is the photograph of Inez Milholland from our archival collection. It is a picture of her on leading one of the New York City parades. She's on a horse there. It's not the white horse that and it's not the most famous picture we see of her on a horse, but she was already well known. The suffrage movement well understood that Milholland's good looks, the fact that she was married, made her an important symbol of the movement, whose leaders were consciously moving to counter an image of the suffragist as mannish, man-hating women. As the New York Sun quoted, quote, "No suffrage parade was complete without Inez Milholland, for with her tall and free step, her rich brown hair, blue eyes, and fair skin and well-cut features, she was an ideal figure of the typical American woman." Well, African American suffragists did not fit into this traditional white image of ideal womanhood. Alice Paul, in favor of Black voting rights, originally invited Black suffragists to march. But when a group of white women objected to their participation, Paul acquiesced, determined not to antagonize the Southern white suffragists who shunned the prospect of supporting Black voting rights. She expected that a very few Black women would march inconspicuously scattered within the parade of 5,000 women. But when some 30 African American suffragists from Howard University insisted on marching under their own banner with the other college delegations, Paul refused. Facing determined resistance from African Americans and some of their white allies, she compromised by allowing them to march, but separating them from white women by a delegation of white male suffrage allies. Mary Church Terrell, the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, marched proudly with the Howard delegation. However, when the renowned African-American journalist, activist Ida Wells Barnett, head of the Illinois Black Suffrage Organization, the Alpha League, was told she needed to march with a separate Black group, she refused, stepping from the crowd during the parade to join the regular Illinois state delegation. Some white suffragists firmly advocated for Black women's voting rights, including many of the prominent Vassar graduates. Milholland actually objected to Paul's planned banning of the Howard women, but in the end, she acquiesced to Paul's compromise, riding in the parade that Paul wanted. Ironically, according to Milholland's biographer, her, quote, unofficial anointment by the press and suffragists as suffragists' ideal woman symbolized the movement's exclusionary nature. It'd be decades before white feminists would address racism in the women's movement and the danger of imaging the ideal woman as white, well-educated, beautiful, heterosexual, and wealthy. Unquote. The racism that marked the era of social reform and the expansion of women's rights also lived on the Vassar campus. While Smith and Wellesley admitted Black students, Vassar at the time never knowingly admitted African Americans. Mount Holyoke and Bryn Mawr too refused Black women admission. The tension between this stance and the more progressive views on race was evident in May 1911 when Ida Alice Trutala, class of 1900, an instructor at the historically Black Hampton Institute, brought a quartet of singers to campus for a concert, a program that included a speech by the Institute's head. But Vassar's acceptance of these guests clearly had its limits, however. The singers ate at a separate table in the dining room. Some students left rather than eat in the same dining room with the Hampton group. As the suffrage movement grew nationally, the increasing militancy of Paul, Burns, and their allies led to a permanent split with Nassau, which would affect the politics of suffrage on the Vassar campus. In 1914, Paul organized the Congressional Union, the CU. Blatch merged her organization with the CU, and within 3 years, the militants formed the National Woman's Party, the NWP. President Mccracken made known his hostility to the more militant faction. During the 50th anniversary celebration of the college in 1915, which coincided with his inauguration, he refused to allow a CU-sponsored rally on campus in support of the federal amendment, which was known as the Susan B. Anthony Amendment. And it was to feature Vassar alums Lucy Burns, Crystal Eastman, Inez Mahan, and Elsie Hill. Next slide, Paul. So this is a poster that we have in the archives, this fabulous poster, and it's also framed and is in the archives. It hangs in the archive room, but it's for an event which never happened. But it's a very cool poster. But thanks to President Mccracken, it did not happen. A year later, Mccracken, who seemed to have a particular objection to Mulholland, again refused to let her speak at Vassar. On the other hand, Mccracken did support NASA suffrage activities off campus, and he also backed the campus organization, the Equal Suffrage League. In 1915, the Vassar chapter worked hard on behalf of the New York State referendum for women's suffrage, which first appeared on the ballot that fall. And this is important. Appreciating these state-by-state campaigns is important. While the state-by-state approach to suffrage was slow and problematic for a variety of reasons, we should appreciate that these campaigns attracted widespread participation of women in their local communities. Women had been active on the local level in grassroots organizations, in clubs, religious organizations, a variety of causes for decades. And we can see how local and state initiatives like the 1915 referendum campaign on behalf of women's suffrage loosened the boundaries between Vassar and her immediate neighbors. The 50th anniversary took place in October 1915, just before the New York ballot referendum. Two of the most prominent alumna participants at Vassar's golden anniversary also spoke at a massive rally downtown Poughkeepsie on behalf of the New York campaign at the Masonic Temple, 32 Cannon Street, which a number of you know that building, which was, and it was wide covered in the Poughkeepsie newspapers. Next slide. Okay, so this can be better seen in the exhibit, when you click on it in the exhibit, okay? But this is the coverage in the Poughkeepsie Evening Enterprise of the event. Catherine Davis was one of the prominent speakers, class of 1892. She was there for the golden anniversary. She was New York City Commissioner of Corrections. Julia Lathrop, class of 1880, who was clearly the headliner here, appointed in 1912 by President William Howard Taft as head of the newly created Children's Bureau. She was the first woman to ever head a federal agency. And so she was the most well-known, and she got a lot of coverage here. And if you get a chance to look more at this page from the Poughkeepsie Evening Enterprise, it is interesting, right? First of all, it's on the what we used to call the woman's page, right? Because, you know, this was about women's suffrage, and so only women would care. And so on the left, you see the headline, Julia Lathrop to speak at mass meeting at the Masonic Temple, and then there's her picture. On the right is a headline, same size, about new styles in hat wear and in fur. So you could sort of see a sense of how this was covered in those days, very much of the moment. Mccracken himself traveled throughout New York to speak on behalf of suffrage. Paula, that's the last slide, so you can just, okay, there I am. Okay. Mccracken himself traveled throughout New York to speak on behalf of suffrage, though he maintained that as college president, he could not take an active part in the 1915 campaign. But faculty members actively participated in the push. As early as spring 1914, in an effort to energize the African American community on behalf of the referendum, as Bill Jeffway's work has shown, a meeting of the African American congregants of Poughkeepsie's AME Zion Church, and the city's Equal Suffrage League took place. The speakers included church members, among them Sadie Peterson, who offered a poem entitled A Suffrage Call. Along a number of Vassar faculty also spoke. In the fall of 1915, Vassar students joined the effort, selling suffrage publications in dormitories, canvassing in Poughkeepsie, marching in New York City. In September, junior Mary Culver, in a letter to her father, included a sticker on the envelope with the by then ubiquitous slogan of the movement, Votes for Women. The sticker has a US map showing the status of suffrage state by state. And we have that envelope in the collection with that sticker, and you can see it as part of the digital exhibition. It's really cool. In October, Culver wrote home that, quote, next weekend, I am going to New York City to the Suffrage Parade, and perhaps anticipating some family objections. Oh, yes, I am. There are about 20 other Vassar students who are going to march in that parade. The 1915 campaign was soundly defeated, with only 6 counties in New York, mostly rural, voting in favor. Despite the ballot defeat, Carrie Chapman Catt, the new head of Nassau, remained convinced that winning the most populated state in the Union, New York, would put critical pressure on politicians nationwide to adopt suffrage. Thus, Nassau and others took up the cause of another referendum in 1917, and this time the New York campaign was well organized, not only in New York City, but throughout the state. The New York Women's Suffrage Party reached out to trade union suffragists, and they were very active in suffrage, and they also participated in a number of parades. And they reached out to the already very active New York City Colored Women's Suffrage Club. The Poughkeepsie Women's Suffrage Party, along with the Vassar community, worked hard mobilizing the vote throughout the city. Again, Mccracken spoke in favor of suffrage.
Possibly more interesting than what I'm listening to.
Oh, yeah.
Somebody is not muted.
I mean, it's sort of interesting.
I learned what dishes can in legend.
Oh, what do they make?
Somebody is not muted. I'm just going to go on, okay? All right, the referendum passed by 100,000 votes, with most of it coming from New York City. But Poughkeepsie also added its assent. While Carrie Catt and Nassau saw victories in New York, along with that of the other large states, as critical in moving the nation closer to suffrage, Alice Paul and the militants remained focused on a national amendment. And to that end, Paul, Burns, and their NWP allies took a new approach, campaigning against Woodrow Wilson's 1916 re-election because he refused to endorse the amendment. In 1917, with the media-savvy Lucy Burns as a driving force, they took the unprecedented step for anyone, let alone women, of picketing in front of the White House with large banners targeting the newly elected president for his inaction. Just before she died in 1916, during a whirlwind speaking tour for the NWP, Milholland asked, Mr. President, how long must women go on fighting for liberty? In tribute to their famous now fallen comrade, the picketers carried banners displaying her words. When the US entered World War I in April, the Silent Sentinels, as the picketers were called, continued their soundless protest, carrying signs pointing out the hypocrisy of leading in a war to protect democracy while the United States failed to support women's suffrage. Wilson tolerated the picketing until June 1917, when police began arresting women for obstructing traffic. Lucy Burns was the first, but hardly the last to be hauled away. About 500 women were arrested between 1917 and 1919, including at least 10 other Vassar alums. About 150 people served jail time. In the spring and summer, the women were imprisoned for a few days, but in the fall, they faced long prison sentences of anywhere from 60 days to 6 months, where they languished in wretched conditions. In protesting the situation, the NWP's journal, The Suffragist, showed the limits of its democratic vision, noting that the harsh treatment included being, quote, thrown into the workhouse, with Negroes and criminals, unquote. In November, when their demands to be treated as political prisoners failed, 15 women began hunger strikes, including Elizabeth McShane Hillis, class of 1913. She, along with Burns and others, were force-fed. Hillis kept jail notes on her prison experience, which she donated to Vassar's collection in 1971. That's a very cool thing to look at. In fact, the picketers were not arrested for blocking traffic. They were arrested for criticizing the war's hypocrisy, and in that they were not alone. To quell the mounting anti-war sentiment, the federal government instituted massive suffrage of the written or spoken opinion, which was a major assault on the First Amendment. And so the women who picketed the White House were pioneers in the fight on behalf of civil liberties, along with political rights. Indeed, a federal court in 1918 agreed with them, declaring their arrest unconstitutional. The police, however, continued to arrest the women who picketed the White House, the Capitol, and yes, Lafayette Square, the very site where in 2020 federal law enforcement removed peaceful demonstrators supporting the Black Lives Matter movement. The more conservative Nassau leadership criticized the Militants for picketing the president, and those divisions within the movement were reflected in the Vassar community as well. Julia Lathrop signed on to a petition of 30 suffragists, mostly government employees like her, criticizing the heckling tactics of the Militants. Lucy Maynard Salmon had been on the advisory board of Paul's Congressional Union for a while, but left. During the war, Nassau President Catt, who was a lifelong pacifist, made a strategic decision to support Wilson and to mobilize women across the country to contribute to the war effort in numerous ways, from volunteering at the Red Cross to becoming nurses, taking on new jobs while men served in the military, planting victory gardens. If women, like men, contributed to the national defense, she argued, then women too should be given full political rights. At Vassar, with Mccracken very much setting the tone, he was the founder of the National Junior Red Cross, faculty and students turned to aiding the war effort. Students participated in Red Cross training courses on how to aid the injured. They conserved food, raised money for European relief. And towards the end of the war, the college played a special role in contributing to the effort by addressing the shortages of nurses needed to tend the wounded. In the summer of 1918, with the cooperation of the Red Cross, the Council of National Defense, Vassar recruited college graduates from all parts of the country to be trained as nurses on the campus and then placed in American hospitals for accelerated training. The wartime strategies of both the Militants and Nassau paid off. The public, unaccustomed to seeing prosperous white women treated so harshly, were outraged by the jailing and the force feeding of suffragists, which put pressure on Wilson to support the federal amendment. Women's contribution to the war, along with Nassau's determined lobbying, persuaded him also to commit to the constitutional protection of the vote of women. And finally, because a number of states passed suffrage by the decade's end, pressure mounted on legislators from the other states to endorse suffrage. The amendment made its way through Congress in 1919 with ratification by the requisite number of states in August 1920. The triumph of the 19th Amendment exemplifies the paradoxical history of the fight for political freedom in America. Its passage occurred at a time of nativist and racist backlash, along with concerted efforts to stem the labor movement. Many Black women and men, especially in the South, couldn't vote, nor could most Indigenous and Asian Americans. Many Latinx also had to struggle for voting rights. After 1920, the struggle would go on as women and men would continue to fight for basic citizenship rights and a truly inclusive society, both on campus and in the wider world. And the Vassar suffragists were part of this ongoing struggle. After the passages of the amendment, many kept up their support of women's rights and other movements for social justice. Now we can begin, said Crystal Eastman in 1920, and she continued to promote women's access to jobs and to support reproductive rights. She was also one of the founding members of the American Civil Liberties Union, Blatch remained active in the Socialist Party and the NWP. Lathrop ensured the passage of the first federal public health program, which provided infant maternal health care to women across the country. Hillis worked for the Amalgamated Clothing Workers of America Union and was also working to eradicate occupational diseases. Hillis was the one who wrote the jail notes when she was force fed. At age 79, Hillis responded to an alumni questionnaire by reporting the quote, she was working to defeat Nixon and end the Vietnam War and was interested in disarmament, racial integration, conservation of natural resources, and improvement of public education. Hazel Hunkins Hallinan, class of 13, a Vassar picketer who actually chained herself to the White House gate in 1917, worked in the labor movement, served as a diplomat, and continued to fight for women's rights, including the Equal Rights Amendment. And in the late 20th century, a new generation of Vassar students would push for African American voting rights and on campus for a racially diverse student body, along with a new attention to an unfinished feminist agenda. And they would also challenge faculty and administrators to embrace a curriculum that would give previously marginal groups their rightful place. Continuing in that tradition, 21st century Vassar students, faculty, and alumni take up the struggles again and again for basic civil, political, social rights for a more just, inclusive society, both on campus and in the wider world. So thanks. Okay, so yeah.
So I wanted to see if anybody, we have time for maybe 2 or 3 questions. So if anybody would like to ask a question, can you please unmute yourself for that time so we can actually and ask question to Miriam. Thank you.
Questions, comments?
And comment, yes.
Hi, I'm Betty Lugo. I just want to thank you, Professor Cohen. Your presentation was excellent, excellent. And, you know, we need you. I'm in Brooklyn. We need to bring you to Brooklyn. I saw that Inez Mulholland was from Brooklyn.
Absolutely, she was. That is true. That is true. So yeah, so sure. So thanks. I mean, when we all can do stuff like that, right? When we can all have, yeah.
Right. So my question is, and we're trying to research this. I'm an attorney.
Right.
I'm the founder of the first Hispanic women-owned law firm in New York.
Great.
And also past president of the Puerto Rican Bar Association.
Right.
And we were researching Puerto Rican and Hispanic women involved in the suffrage movement, and we couldn't find any.
See, and there's been more and more work that is uncovering that, and it varied from place to place. And I know right now that there's been a lot of work uncovered about the organizing among Hispanic women and Anglo women, and often the coalitions out west. But there are probably people who know the answer to that. My guess is with more work, we're going to find some, but it may vary. It's also the Puerto Rican, of course, population in New York City, for example, bumps up. They, of course, are an exception in the 20s, the 30s. The numbers may get high enough a little bit later for other kinds of organizing. But I can certainly tell you that in terms of the work that's been done out west we're finding, good stuff about that. So excellent.
We're going to invite you to Brooklyn so you can do the program for us. Also for the New York State Bar Association. I'm the chair of the trial lawyers, and I'm going to get the women in law section because your presentation was awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you.
You should also go look at the exhibition online too. The kinds of things we have. It's really the people who did that. Mark Seidel, the archivist, did a wonderful job.
Beautiful. Thank you.
We have a question from the room.
Hey, how you doing? Hi. Awesome presentation.
Thanks.
And I mean, it was awesome. Can you just reiterate all the places where you said we could see some of the writings, the letters? Because I'm a place I love to go. So,
well, listen. Well, right now I wish you could go, and that was the original. The original plan was to have an on-site exhibition, at the library of our archives. And the nature of the space and the fact that we're trying to limit numbers of people meant that we could not do that. But it's online. The exhibition is online, and in some ways, you know, and I'm looking at the director of that, Nicole is right here. And so what you do is go to the Vassar Library webpage. You know, you go to Vassar College, Vassar Library, the Thompson Libraries, and on the web page under announcements.
Sorry, can you
at
put
the very bottom?
Can you put the link if you have it on the
Sure.
chat, or if you can send it to me? I can send it to all the.
Why don't I send it to you if that's all right? Because
I will send it. I will send it to everybody.
But,
okay.
But yes, but that link will take you to the exhibition and the longer essay too. So that's good.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
I think we have one more question. If anybody is available. Okay, I think that otherwise we're good. So I think that what I will do, I will as soon as I receive the information from Professor Cohen, I will send it to everybody that is in the mailing list and to the people present here.
Yeah, maybe I can. No, if I had access to it now, I would quickly type it. But I will get it to you. Okay.
Okay. Yeah. I actually.
No, wait. Somebody has done it for me.
But somebody sent
there
it.
It is. That's it. And we've got two. And Lydia has done it, and Rachel's done it. Thank you. Thank you. Because there it is. Okay.
I will save it anyway because.
But for those of you, yeah, there it is. Do you guys see everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. So I will say thank you very much. And I really appreciate your time.
Thank you all for your interest. And the struggle's not over. We know the issue around voting. So it's important to see this as a moment in history. Okay. Thanks.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody. Thank you.